Perhaps a breakthrough in the battle for Blind Bay. Announced today, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection will look at other sites for a new facility, not completely abandoning Blind Bay, though. With reaction, here's 7 News reporter Lexi Bruning.
This is a big step forward.
A step forward, advocates say, towards saving the wildlife and muskies that call Blind Bay home. Congresswoman Tenney announced Wednesday Customs and Border Protection will look at sites other than Blind Bay for a new facility.
We are hopeful that they're going to find an alternative site that's not environmentally sensitive and that will allow us to save Blind Bay, which is a true environmental treasure.
Advocates are encouraged by the news, but acknowledge the battle for Blind Bay isn't over. The location hasn't been dropped by CBP.
And we recognize that there is a legal process that Customs and Border Protection has to follow, and that does create kind of this slow-moving uncertainty.
Officials and advocates for Blind Bay have recommended Bonnie Castle Recreation Center as an alternative location for the facility, citing its close proximity to the intersection of State Route 12 and Interstate 81.
So it would fulfill most of their mission.
Both Assemblyman Scott Gray and State Senator Mark Walczyk say meetings with CBP have been successful.
The first meeting, we just kind of staked out our ground and we reiterated what the community has been saying. And the second meeting, there was progress.
They've assured us that communication is going to be better moving forward and want to work with local stakeholders to see what opposition is out there before they look at other sites, which makes a lot of sense.
In a statement to 7 News, CBP says it will look at feasible properties and no decisions have been made. Lexi Bruning, 7 News.